Imagine for a second claiming to be a hardcore fundamentalist constitutional absolutist.
Right, like you're waving the document around for everyone to see.
Exactly. But at the exact same time, you were openly declaring that the Supreme Court has absolutely no authority to actually interpret that law.
You love the rules, but you entirely reject the system built to enforce them.
Yes. And that paradox is exactly what's currently playing out at the highest levels of the Catholic Church. Today, we're taking a deep dive into an intense, decades-long institutional standoff. It's between the Vatican and this breakaway traditionalist group known as the Society of St. Pius X, or the SSPX.
And honestly, it serves as an incredibly rich case study for you, even if you aren't Catholic, because when you look past the religious vestments, you're really watching a massive 2,000-year-old organization try to enforce its core identity.
Yeah, managing its boundaries.
Right, and trying to rein in a rogue faction that actually claims to be, more faithful to the company mission than the CEO is.
It's fascinating. And I want to mention right up front, we are pulling all the material for today's deep dive directly from an article on the website epistles.online.
Which is a great resource.
It really is. If you're exploring this space, epistles.online is unique because they take and promote a really balanced take on Catholicism. They intentionally carve out a path that avoids modernism on one side and radical, unhealthy traditionalism on the other.
Yeah, it cuts right through the noise. But before we dig into the actual mechanics of this standoff, we really need to set a firm ground rule for today's discussion.
Oh, definitely. A very important disclaimer.
Right, because the text we're analyzing touches on deeply held religious beliefs and some really intense institutional politics. So our role here is just to impartially report on and analyze the concepts presented in the epistles article.
We are not taking sides here.
Exactly. We aren't endorsing any theological viewpoints, and we aren't validating the claims of any specific faction. We're just looking at the source material.
We're looking at the how and the why of institutional management. We aren't here to declare a theological winner. So, let's establish the players. Who is actually laying down the law for the Vatican? And, well, why does this ideological clash exist in the first place?
Well, the primary framework for our source material comes from this pivotal 2012 interview. It was conducted by Edward Penton, who is a distinguished Vatican reporter and the author of The Next Pope.
Okay.
And he sat down with Cardinal Gerhard Müller. Now, at the time, Cardinal Müller was the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith.
Which is essentially the Vatican's chief doctrinal watchdog.
Right.
Like the highest authority on the rules, just under the Pope himself.
Yeah, exactly. He is a heavyweight theologian. He actually oversaw the publication of the collected works of Pope Benedict XVI.
Wow.
So when Müller speaks on Catholic doctrine, he speaks with immense theological weight. And his first major task in this interview is addressing the SSPX's core accusation.
Which is what exactly?
Basically, the SSPX looks at the modern church and says, you've changed the rules. The teachings of the past contradict the teachings of the present.
I always picture this as like a massive generational family dispute.
Mm-hmm.
These strange children are pointing fingers saying, you aren't who you used to be. And the parent is just insisting, look, we've grown, the house looks a bit different, but we're the exact same family.
That's a really good way to frame it.
So how does Müller logically defend the idea that a 2,000-year-old institution hasn't actually contradicted itself?
He relies on what's known as the principle of non-contradiction. Müller argues that on a fundamental doctrinal level, the church simply cannot contradict herself. It's a theological impossibility.
Okay, so he's saying the contradiction is just made up.
Basically, yes. He says the perceived contradiction that the SSPX is so angry about is an illusion. It's caused by false interpretation and, honestly, just the passage of time.
See, that sounds a bit like a convenient loophole to me. Like, how does that actually work in practice?
Well, let's look at the mechanics of it. You're dealing with texts spanning multiple centuries, right? Written in completely different historical contexts.
Sure.
They're addressing different cultural crises, and they're translated across multiple languages. So the terminology naturally evolves. For example, a 19th century papal document might harshly condemn freedom of religion.
Which sounds terrible to modern ears.
Right. But at that specific time in Europe, that phrase meant the state aggressively dismantling the church and declaring all truth relative.
Okay. But then a 20th century document comes along and might promote freedom of religion because, well, they are fighting totalitarian regimes.
Exactly. Defending the individual's right not to be coerced by a dictator. The underlying reality remains the same. that truth matters and the state shouldn't crush the conscience.
Even though the actual vocabulary shifted dramatically.
Yes. So Müller's argument is that the SSPX is experiencing a tension that arises from that changing terminology. The doctrine develops and deepens, but it never flips to mean the exact opposite of what it meant before.
So the SSPX is like reading 16th century texts and 21st century texts side by side, seeing different vocabulary, and mistakenly declaring a structural collapse.
That's his argument, yeah.
But if it's merely a dispute over historical translation, why is there this massive schism? I mean, this clearly goes far beyond a debate over vocabulary.
Oh, definitely. It goes directly to the mechanics of authority and communion. Once Müller establishes that the doctrine hasn't broken, he starts laying out this escalating ladder of organizational control.
The rules of belonging.
Right. He outlines what it actually means to belong to this institution. And the very first rung on that ladder is the moral obligation of communion.
Meaning you have to actually be visibly in the club. You can't just be a remote fan cheering from the sidelines.
Exactly. Belonging to the Catholic Church is not just some private internal disposition or, a warm feeling in your heart. It requires public, visible communion with the Pope and the bishops.
Which is pretty standard for any rigid hierarchy.
It is. Now, Müller does add a caveat for what he calls impulpable ignorance, which is God's mercy for people who genuinely just don't know this truth.
Okay, fair enough.
But for a group like the SSPX, who are highly educated in Catholic theology, they are morally bound to remain within the visible institutional structure.
Which brings us right to the Pope. Because you really can't have visible communion without recognizing the boss.
And that is the second rung, acceptance of papal primacy. Müller states that true adherence to tradition actually requires accepting the dogmas of the First Vatican Council.
And what did that council do?
It explicitly established the Pope's universal jurisdiction.
Okay, so this is exactly where that Supreme Court analogy comes into play. The SFPX built their entire brand around preserving tradition with a capital T.
Right.
But within the framework of Catholicism, the ultimate tradition is the authority of the papacy.
You hit the nail on the head. You cannot claim to defend a tradition while rejecting the very entity that writes and enforces the rules of that tradition.
This doesn't work.
It doesn't. And that leads directly to Müller's next requirement, submission to the authentic magisterium.
Let's define that term mechanically for a second. The magisterium is essentially the teaching authority of the church, right? Like the binding interpretation of the corporate bylaws.
That is a highly accurate way to look at it, actually. Müller tells the SSPX that it is not enough for them to have their own private interpretation of what historical tradition means.
Unity requires a shared understanding.
Exactly. They must accept the Pope's authentic interpretation of the teachings.
He is pulling rank here in a very absolute way. He is completely stripping away their ability to act as independent auditors of the Vatican.
He's making it crystal clear that this is not a diplomatic negotiation between two sovereign nations.
Right.
The SSPX is a very small portion of the church. They don't get to just sit across a negotiating table and tweak the terms of their surrender until they're happy.
It's an ultimatum.
Yes. Their submission is a non-negotiable requirement of Catholic ecclesiology.
Okay, so once Müller establishes that the Pope is the ultimate executive authority, we have to look at how that actually applies to the rules on the ground.
The practical stuff.
Yeah, the highly visible flashpoints of this conflict, which are the modern changes to the Mass and the Church's relationship with the modern world. But real quick, before we get into the specifics of those changes, a note for you if you're wanting to explore these deep theological currents further.
Because there's a vast amount of literature on this era of church history.
There really is. And Epistles supports virtuous, tradition-leaning Catholic authors. So for your convenience, book links are included directly on their website, epistles.online.
It's a fantastic curated list.
You'll find incredible titles there, including works from Sophia Institute Press. So if you're looking to purchase books to expand your understanding of these topics, we strongly encourage you to use the links provided on epistles.online to support their work.
It really is the best way to move past the brief internet summaries and get to the actual primary sources.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So let's get into the actual battleground. What are the modern flashpoints where the SSPX fundamentally refuses to submit?
Well, the flashpoints center almost entirely on the 1960s, specifically the Second Vatican Council and the subsequent changes to the Mass.
Okay.
Müller lays out the final sticking points, starting with the fact that Vatican II is not optional.
Now, Vatican II was that massive ecumenical council that modernized a lot of church practices, right? Like it allowed the Mass to be said in local languages instead of just Latin, and it changed how the church interacts with other religions.
That's right.
So why does the SSPX resist it so fiercely?
The SSPX argues that Vatican II introduced ambiguous language that deliberately allowed modernism to sneak into the church. They view the council not as a theological development, but as a contagion.
Wow.
But Müller clarifies the institutional reality here. Vatican II was an official ecumenical council. While the documents do vary in their level of authority, the dogmatic constitutions, which are the core documents, are binding elements of the Catholic faith.
To use our corporate analogy again, the SSPX views Vatican II as a disastrous rebranding campaign that they just want to opt out of.
Right, but Müller is saying, no, these are the new binding corporate bylaws. You don't get to just ignore them.
Makes sense. And the second major flashpoint.
It's the Mass itself. The SSPX exclusively celebrates the traditional Latin Mass.
Right.
They argue that the Novus Ordo, which is the new Mass promulgated by Pope Paul VI after Vatican II, stripped away the reverence of the liturgy. They say it opened the door to widespread abuses like casual music and just a total loss of sacredness.
And Müller's response to that?
Müller states that the Church recognizes the perennial validity of the traditional Latin Mass. The Vatican does allow it. However, and this is an absolute red line, the SSPX must publicly concede that the Novus Ordo is a valid and legitimate sacrament.
So they can't just call it fake.
Exactly. They can prefer the Latin Mass aesthetically and spiritually, sure, but they cannot declare the new Mass invalid or illegitimate.
I want to push back on the Vatican strategy here for a second. Because the SSPX is looking at the broader church, and they're seeing what they consider to be severe liberal liturgical abuses. Clown masses, liturgical dancing, a total loss of reverence.
Right, the real extremes.
Yeah, and they view themselves as the loyal soldiers defending the dignity of the liturgy. So why does the Vatican reject their help in correcting those errors?
That's a great question, and Müller actually addresses this exact dynamic through a concept we can call the role of the center.
Okay, how does that work?
He fully acknowledges that there are liberal extremes and severe liturgical abuses out there that absolutely need correcting. But he argues that traditionalist extremes cannot be the remedy for liberal extremes.
You don't cure a rogue faction on the left by embracing a rogue faction on the right.
Precisely. The official authority of the Church, the center, holds the exclusive mandate to correct abuses and maintain order.
Because if you let anyone enforce the rules,
you undermine the entire hierarchy. If you allow a splinter group to act as the police, the institution just fractures into competing warlords. The extremes have to be pulled back by the center.
So the Vatican is essentially telling the SSPX, look, we appreciate that you care deeply about the reverence of the rules, but we are the umpires, not you.
That is the crux of the institutional standoff. And Müller laid out these incredibly clear, non-negotiable boundaries back in 2012.
Which brings us to the present day. Because this isn't just a historical debate from a decade ago, it is escalating rapidly. Let's look at the December 2025 update from our source material to see why the standoff has suddenly become such an urgent crisis.
Yeah, Cardinal Müller recently reflected on this long-standing impasse, and his assessment was pretty blunt. He noted that there have been endless dialogues with the SSPX, but they simply circle around without any real progress.
And now?
And now, the SSPX is reportedly planning to consecrate new bishops without the approval of Rome.
We need to explain why that specific action is the absolute nuclear option. Who was Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, and why does making a bishop matter so much?
Archbishop Lefebvre was the French prelate who founded the SSPX in 1970 to preserve those traditional practices. And in 1988, against the explicit orders of Pope John Paul II, Lefebvre consecrated 4 bishops.
Okay.
That act of direct disobedience resulted in his automatic excommunication, and it formalized the schism.
Right, because consecrating a bishop isn't just giving someone a promotion. A bishop has the power to ordain new priests.
Exactly.
If a rogue group can make their own bishops, they can create a self-sustaining parallel hierarchy forever. They literally no longer need the Vatican for anything.
It is the ultimate act of institutional defiance. It completely crosses the line from internal protest to creating a rival corporate structure. Doing it again now would be a massive escalation.
Wow.
Yet, despite this impending crisis, Müller maintains a surprisingly broad perspective.
How can he remain optimistic when a faction is about to cross the ultimate red line?
Well, Müller points out that the SSPX is not the only breakaway group the Church is dealing with. In his view, there are far worse factions on the opposite, liberal side of the spectrum factions that are actively denying the essential foundational truths of Christianity.
Oh, I see.
By comparison, the SSPX holds firmly to the core tenets of the historical faith, even while defying papal authority. Because of that shared foundation, Müller feels a duty to continually invite them back from the ledge.
The Epistles article uses a striking phrase here. It refers to the SSPX's sectarian impulse. If they get into that impulse and proceed with these illicit consecrations, what is the mechanical consequence for them?
The consequence is that remaining in an irregular situation will just permanently deepen their isolation. If they want to return, they must seek what is called canonical regularization.
And canonical regularization isn't just saying, hey, we're sorry. It is the legal binding of the group back into the Vatican's chain of command, right? Submitting their properties, their priests, and their obedience back to the central hierarchy.
It is full integration. The analysis in the text is uncompromising. The Catholic Church does not submit to the SSPX. The SSPX must submit to the Church.
Yeah.
If they truly want to preserve tradition and save souls, isolation is a dead end. True fidelity to tradition cannot exist in a vacuum, completely cut off from the living magisterium.
The threat of excommunication and isolation is the ultimate stick in organizational management. It shows how incredibly difficult it is to manage a massive 2,000-year-old institution with millions of moving parts and warring factions. It requires an ironclad center to hold it all together.
It's a huge undertaking.
But, managing your own workplace shouldn't require decades of theological debate and the threat of excommunication.
Let's hope not.
Exactly. Because one of the main problems in so many workplaces today is plotting schedules for a group of employees. It is stressful, it is incredibly time-consuming, and honestly, bad scheduling can severely affect your team's engagement. Well, a simple, elegant solution to this is a Microsoft Excel-based automated staff scheduling template from staff-scheduling.com. That is spelled out as staff-scheduling.com.
Okay.
It is built with sophisticated formatting and carefully designed formulas. All you do is enter your employees' names and their shifts, and the template automatically shows the number of staff working at any given time of the day. It also instantly calculates the total hours and days already assigned to each employee. It is a massive real-time saver that completely eliminates the headache of manual plotting.
That sounds incredibly useful.
It is. You have to check it out at www.staff-scheduling.com. So bringing it back to our deep dive.
Right. Whether you have a background in theology or you simply find organizational dynamics fascinating, this whole saga is a masterclass.
It really is.
It demonstrates exactly how ancient organizations define their boundaries, enforce their core identity, and attempt to corral rogue factions without compromising the central authority that keeps the whole structure from collapsing.
This deep dive again is taken from epistles.online, Guarding the Deposit of Faith. We highly encourage you to access the website and subscribe to it to keep exploring these crucial conversations.
And I just want to leave you with a final lingering question to ponder on your own. We've talked extensively today about the absolute necessity of the center holding the line to prevent chaos.
Right.
But when an organization strictly enforces the authority of its center to avoid extremes on both the left and the right, does it purely preserve its integrity, or does it risk leaving some of its most passionate, dedicated members permanently out in the cold?
Something to think about. Until next time, thanks for taking the deep dive.